What's the music do? Anything that's raging inside you. This won't hurt me. And moves and moves. Seems I'm whispering on you. Twisted transistor.
Hello everybody and welcome to Amphlett Reviews, back on another Hong Kong content review, continuing on with the Mr. Vampire franchise. We're at number 5 now, Vampire vs. Vampire, or Mr. Vampire 5, or whatever the many titles there are for these films. They keep on altering, just down to research, part of the Eureka edition box set, which is the final one of that edition. This time it's directed by Lam Ching-ying, which returns back to this franchise. Thank God, after watching the 4th movie, and he is back as the main character and he's directing this time around, which surprisingly, he's only done one other movie, which is a bit of a Green Hornet TV movie spin-off, so I've not had a chance to do much directing work, unfortunately, down to his very early passing during the late 90s, which I'll go more into the last one with that, with Magic Cop, but it's a real tragedy and real shame that, cancer, it's horrible. It's a real horrible disease, and it takes away amazing talent so early, especially when their career in which their persona, their personality, a character like this is blossoming so much. And I'm glad he managed to get such a vibrant career ultimately. But I'm so glad to check out this film from this director and him welcoming him. Please, well, thank you for coming back. Return to this franchise, because I really did not like the 4th one. This time around, it is Vampire vs. Vampire, released in 1989. We've got all returning characters and characters coming back with Ching Yao-ho, which was also in the first movie, which is great to see him back in this one, and also Billy Lau as well, playing the general police officer, which he played within the first movie, but not in the 3rd one. I don't know if it's meant to be the same character, or I don't care anymore. The continuity is a little bit kind of fuzzy. However, he's back playing a very similar type of role as has been established already within the first one, which is Lam Ching-ying bringing his absolutely best performance, I would say, as the priest character, the Tansman priest character in his own kind of directed entry Mr. Vampire film. I honestly say this is actually his best performance, considering the first one, he was straight up excellent, and he's maintained this role really well throughout the series of movies. And I honestly think he's actually had more to do in this one, down to the fact of the action and the stunt work, and just his attitude, and he very much is the same character that he has been in previous films, but he has a lot more to do, and he has a lot more going on. He has a side story with a nun character, which I think is actually quite cute and quite interesting, quite funny. He's having a lot more of a tough time battle between this classic kind of more British kind of stereotype vampire, which I'll get into in a little bit. Film Vampire vs. Vampire is very misleading because there is no Vampire vs. Vampire. I actually don't even think there's any proper hopping vampires in the film, apart from the little kid, which is the comic relief, which I think is this little guy over here. Now, considering this franchise likes to do hopping vampire kids, especially within the second film, I didn't really care for it too much in the second one, but it was minuscule, it was very kind of brief, and it kind of added something to it, which I think was a bit odd for this type of 15-rated, R-rated franchise. This time around, the kid in this one, I think is actually really funny, really well used, really well utilized, and adds a lot of great comic relief, little kind of practical effects and gadgets and all sorts. And in fact, he turns up with dynamite and just kind of had some kind of interesting kind of odd comic relief to it, and helping kind of Lam Ching-ying's going against the classic vampire, which I think adds to so much oddity to the film, which I think is great. So in terms of the only hopping vampire really in the film, I think they actually did a pretty good job, and I actually quite liked the dynamic between that little vampire and the kind of students, which is a bit of kind of comic relief kind of happening back and forth, which I think is quite funny, alongside the kind of haunting ghost, which is kind of looming around towards the second half, which is a bit of a side story with our kind of supporting characters. That kind of goes off into a really dark kind of storyline, allow the kind of the ghost to kind of enter their body and then kind of seal it to experience their kind of memories and their kind of feelings and their passion and their last moments on Earth, essentially. And I like that kind of contrast between the kind of the glamorous lifestyle one of these ghosts had. I think they were kind of a prostitute, they were in a brothel, and then the other kind of student kind of, character basically takes on, and basically was kind of terrorized and killed in a very horrible, nasty way. And they were really angry about that, and they've kind of seen that through the kind of Contact taking some justice against the kind of the brothel kind of pin bosses. And there's a little kind of awesome little fight sequence that happens in that, which I think is quite cool. Some of the little sub storylines I think is actually quite interesting. By a Catholic vampire, which is not Dracula, which I think a lot of people do say, which it's not. It just happens to be a more traditional vamp. I like the fact that Ching's character is basically a little bit out of its depth in this one. He doesn't know how to kind of take this one down. In fact, his usual kind of tricks and his trade and his kind of knowledge of this world is very much stumped by the kind of the Catholic lore. And I think that's a really interesting aspect to come into it, being the fact we had the Buddhist priest in the last one. Now we've got the Catholic side of it, and that kind of faith coming into the kind of Hong Kong traditions and ground essentially, which I think is quite interesting. And that's a really fun little aspect of the film, which again, surprisingly, takes the third act of the film. It's literally the last half an hour of the film where they actually introduce that kind of traditional British vampire, and the first hour of it is pretty fucking cool. And that's a good example of good pacing, plenty going on in terms of not just kind of messy storyline, but also a good sense of balance between the more silly humor, the more darker humor, practical effects, fighting, adding to the mythology, exploring some of these characters, adding more to them, which I think is really cool. The first hour of the film is an absolute blast. It's probably the easiest kind of pacing that I've seen up until the first one, I would say. There's a lot going on in this film, and there's actually a more traditional kind of demon ghost that just have a bit of a fun time between Lam Ching and the kind of the student characters. That offers some really awesome kind of CGI and kind of practical effects and of nature, which I think is really badass and really cool. I'd actually go as far as to say this is actually probably my favorite sequel entry in the Mr. Vampire franchise, which I don't know what the general consensus of this film is. I don't know if people like this film or don't like it or think it's the weakest one, but I actually got a lot out of this film. I think it's really well directed. I think it has a really tight, really engaging storyline. There's some really kind of oddities to it as well in terms of some of the ghoulish supernatural elements, bringing in a classic, more traditional vampire so late as well into the third act is risky, but still pays off because there's so much going on beforehand, and it's such a tight little group of characters. The humor works. I think the dark humor works. The conversation between the kind of Catholic lore, the nun characters in the film, I think is quite charming, quite funny, and has a bit of a kind of a unusual kind of romantic kind of angle with Lam Ching's character, which I think is quite cool. I think all the practical effects and the fighting, the swordplay work, the little kid vampire with his dynamite, which is great. Supporting character storyline, mini storyline, that's awesome as well. I think that would just pay off. So all of it, it's just a absolute blast from start to finish. It's a very misleading title. I do wish there was a hopping vampire versus more traditional vampire, granted, but it's still a good time nonetheless. I think this is really well directed. Has a really great sense of pacing and kind of breeze towards it. And I think the ending of the film is absolutely hilarious as well with the frogs. That was a good little touch, and I think it's just kind of really silly and funny and just a great time ultimately. And really great watching these films. I've got Magic Cop Next, which will be the final entry in this series of movies I've been doing. I'm aware of Mr. Vampire 1992. I'm finding it extremely difficult to find a copy of that with English subtitles. If anyone has a copy of that, happy to send me it. Please let me know down below, and hopefully I can add to the franchise, add to the series, one last entry as well. But the Magic Cop will be the final one, and I'll be coming up very soon for you guys. So what are your thoughts and opinions on Vampire vs. Vampires? Please comment down below. Love to know your thoughts and opinions. So in the meantime, guys, Amphlett Reviews, signing out.